Can deep dish pizza help you understand the Bible? I smell a rabbit hole. Welcome, my sweet little bunny rabbits. I'm Mythic Realist. This is my microphone, Lars. Today we're going to talk about Bible exegesis and hermeneutics. And you can trust what I have to say on these matters because I have an expired substitute teaching license as well as an expired residential construction license. Now, there are two camps I'd like to see my video. One is liberal Christians or spiritual atheists or progressive universalists, whatever you call yourself. If fundamentalist Christians annoy you, but you still think there's use to talking about religion or the Bible, I want your camp to meet my camp. Maybe we could go camping together. The other camp that I want to see my video is fundamentalist Christians. If you're a restorationist or a revivalist or a reestablishing, rewindy, refurbishist, if you think that everyone except for Jesus and the apostles and Bible writers in your group today are evil or stupid, I want to go camping with you. And I want you guys to talk with each other and see what you guys have in common. Like, you both have the same definition of literal. And it's not just because you're both millennials who grew up on Legally Blonde, which we can all agree is an excellent movie. It's because you both use the term literal the same way when you're arguing about the Bible. Usually when liberals or fundamentalists debate about whether the Bible is literally true, they're asking, is the first impression of the text in this modern age true? A plain reading. Of course, this assumes that the first impression of the text in our age is the same as the first impression of the text as a reader in the same time and place and culture and language that the text was written, which is a big assumption. Another definition of literal is simply the meaning that the author intended. So if the author intended to use hyperbole or allegory or analogy, that's the literal meaning. This is what Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and a lot of conservative Protestants mean by literal interpretation. And guess what, my liberal friends? Even the dreaded evangelicals have some idea of the author's intent being different from modern thinking. For instance, the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy of 1978 says something about this on page 12. A little background. After the Enlightenment had sunk its teeth into the Bible and whipped it around like a pit bull for 200 years, evangelical leaders had had enough. They met in Chicago for some deep dish pizza and some deep dish theological hermeneutics. Here's a quote from page 12.
Scripture is inerrant, not in the sense of being absolutely precise by modern standards, but in the sense of making good its claims and achieving that measure of focused truth at which its authors aimed. I'm from Chicago.
So what it's saying here is that the author's intent is more important than Becky from accounting's first impression of the text. Which makes sense because in order to evaluate a claim, you have to understand what the claim is. And so this means that it's important whether we think the first two chapters of Genesis are history or myth or some genre-bending masterpiece, the Childish Gambino of the Bible.
Oh, look what I'm whipping out. Look how I'm geeking out. Hey.
This is in fact, the type of genre that John Walton, an evangelical, proposes the first two books of Genesis belong to. A mix between myth and history, mytho-history. John Walton says in The Lost World of Adam and Eve, "We must not think of myth as the opposite of history. In the ancient world, myth was often in service of history, giving the events their cosmic or theological framework." He doesn't have an accent. by the way. If the Bible is mytho-history, then critiquing its forensic historical precision or misalignment with hard science mechanics is like critiquing Schindler's List for not being funny enough. Also, defending it as if it were a 1,000-page police report it needlessly pins the Bible against science. And I would like to defend the term myth, not mytho-history. Myth isn't just a stupid explanation for the origin of something. Myth contains useful information about the perennial patterns that exist in reality all around us. Very useful information, pragmatic benefit to myth. And it can use narrative to incorporate what's missing from analytic explanation. Myth is like a bottle of history with theological vitamins added. And our society is sick. Hyper-rationality has caused schizophrenia, autism, OCD, depression, anxiety, and personality disorders. Ian McGilchrist, a leading brain scientist and clinician, prescribes more myth, more art, more fellowship, more ambiguity in our thinking. So let's go over 3 reasons why we should think of Genesis creation as myth, literally. 1, myth ends the Bible versus science debate. The sequence of Genesis, the creation account in chapter 1, differs from the sequence we get from physical sciences like geology and astrophysics. Let's watch what happens when someone tries to reconcile hard science with the Bible without using myth. This is a clip from a debate between Alex O'Connor, who is sophisticated and friendly in debate, the most mythic of skeptics today, aside from maybe Rhett from Good Mythical Morning.
I was born with hair on my chest, a gleam in my eye to latch onto a breast. I cut my own umbilical cord with my razor sharp teeth.
Alex is debating Dinesh D'Souza, and Dinesh builds himself a nice little trap with no escape hatch. Alex, knowing the proper genre of Genesis, plays with Dinesh like a Bengal tiger.
You think that the universe had a beginning?
I would suspect yes.
How did the writers of the book of Genesis know that?
The scientific method has also revealed to us that the Earth was formed much later than the Sun. The Old Testament account tells us that it was the other way around, so it got that bit wrong.
All right. So we're yes. The Bible is not.
So sometimes it gets things right.
No.
Sometimes it gets things wrong. You know.
The Bible is not a science. It's not listing out a scientific.
Well, now hold on a second. You can't now move the goalpost, especially if you're still going to miss. Is it telling us how the universe scientifically formed or not?
It is stating a conclusion, not a process. It's not telling you how the universe was formed.
Right. It also doesn't tell us how the sun was formed, but it tells us that it was formed after the Earth was. On what day is it that God makes the sun? Day 4, something around there.
It obviously can't be day 4 because the concept of day in the original Hebrew doesn't mean day.
Sure, but day 4 comes after day 1, right?
Well, it's describing obviously epochs or periods.
Yeah,
yes.
So actually it's much worse because now the sun is created much later than the Earth.
Okay, so you can see that Dinesh tried to add a little context regarding the author's intent, but he had already framed the discussion as the Bible is true because it makes claims about astrophysics that are correct. And so as he tried to grasp for qualifications and context, he was already stuck in the frame that he had built, that the Bible is really good at science. But what if the Genesis account was not competing for the most accurate description of physical reality, but pointing beyond physical to metaphysical reality? The same concepts of potential and actuality, unity and multiplicity, purpose and chaos, concepts that ancient Greeks like Thales, Plato, and Aristotle were getting at. Let's look at how this plays out in Genesis. This is a chart from Jonathan Pajot's channel, The Symbolic World. So at the top and bottom, there's heaven. Spirit has to do with purpose. Speech has to do with identity, identifying. So there's an ordering effect to heaven. And then there's the watery earth starting out, the chaotic fluidity, the void of potential, the darkness of the unknown. And these are basic ancient Near East symbolic motifs found in Mesopotamian myth and Egyptian myth, but it's also very different, and we'll talk about that later. But these two poles, heaven and earth, will play together over and over in the description, and that's what the sequence is trying to get at, not trying to match a forensic view of the sequence of creation, but it's highlighting this interplay between heaven and earth. So God speaks heavenly purpose, and the waters separate. This is the first sign of actualized order within the chaotic and void earth. Then God creates the sun and moon in heaven, which allows an ordered schedule. So you can see why heaven was associated with order, and still is. It's very predictable. Next is dry ground and sea. This is the first liminal category between heaven and earth. So there's a connection starting to form. Then within the dry ground, there's parts closer to heaven and parts closer to earth. And I'm not talking about like mountains and valleys, topographical elevation. I mean known heaven and unknown earth. Useful or dangerous. And so livestock are known and useful, contrasted with chaotic, dangerous wild animals and hidden, creepy animals, which are harder to identify. They're under rocks or something. And so when we see this contrast again, between animals in the water and birds, the birds are emphatically tied to heaven explicitly. Even the water has its own heaven and earth interplay. So it has useful freshwater fish and it has scary sea monsters of the deep. So we're seeing smaller and smaller contrasts between heaven and earth as the account goes on until we get to man. And man starts out as this androgynous human that combines heaven and earth. And it's the vocation of man to bring identity down into the unknown, animals, naming them, and bringing fragmented portions of the earth together up toward God, toward a purpose, cultivating the earth. And then man splits into two. And this is the smallest of distinctions between heaven and earth, any of the heaven and earth distinctions. It's so small that man and woman share that same vocation of combining heaven and earth, connecting them, and they both contain the image of God. Yet the distinction is real. So this is not a sequence you would get from a forensic report of the world's development, but it's intended to show the purpose of mankind, to bring heaven, identity, order, and purpose to every strange thing we encounter, and to pull all of these things that used to be fragmented and strange into unity toward a shared purpose. And you could see why a tutorial on how to participate in purpose and unity would be helpful in a society that's so nihilistic and lonely as ours. So that solves the physical science versus Bible misalignment. But what if the Bible's sequence of creation contradicts itself? 2, myth resolves contradictions within the Bible. There's something called the documentary hypothesis, which proposes that 4 different groups wrote portions of the Pentateuch, that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. And some who subscribe to this view would say that Genesis chapter 2 was written first by the Yahweh group, then later the Yahwist group, then later chapter 1 was written by the priestly group, which didn't like the original Genesis creation count very much and contradicted it with its own version without bothering to redact the whole thing as one very well. They just kind of slapped them together and called it good.
Fresh start. All right. Fresh start. Maybe we should call ourselves the Brüe brothers because it's feeling so fresh right now. Right?
Let's do another fresh start because I just want to punch you in the face.
Fresh start.
It's the last one.
I have to be able to express myself and say.
So let's put on our tinfoil hats and watch Dan McClellan, highly credentialed Bible scholar, including a master's from Oxford, tell us how the sequence of Genesis chapters 1 and 2 contradict in his Marvel t-shirt and 80s sweatpants. Here we go.
So whereas in Genesis chapter 2, it went humans, plants, animals, in Genesis chapter 1, it goes celestial bodies, plants, animals, humans. A very different order of creation.
Okay, so Genesis 2, humans, plants, animals. Genesis 1, celestial bodies, plants, animals, humans. So it seems like there's a contradiction there. But have no fear. Ba-ba-da-ba! Ancient Near East myth is here. I'll save you. Ancient Near East texts often present doublets of a narrative back to back. One with a macro scale, zoomed out view, and one with a zoomed in micro scale. And so Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish has this, Atrahasis epic has this, Sumerian creation myths have this, and this is what we see in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis chapter 2 verse 5 says, there were no plants of the field and no shrubs of the field. And that sounds like a contradiction with Genesis 1 until you look at the Hebrew. The two phrases are technical agricultural terms. Sahi hasade is wild plants associated with uncultivated land. I don't know why that sounded Asian. Eseb hasad is cultivated crops, grain, agriculture. And this phrase, the last one, never means all vegetation anywhere in the Bible. And so the verse literally tells you why these plants weren't there in Genesis 1 up until Genesis 2. It says, because God had not yet sent rain and there was no human to till the ground. So it's only in the garden that God creates every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And so that doesn't seem like a second creation of plants, but a localized event in Eden. And the animals in Eden were made for the purpose of being named by Adam, not for the purpose of filling the earth, as in chapter 1. And there's no sea animals mentioned. And so that it just makes it seem like it's not a comprehensive new account. It's a localized continuation of the macro scale account. So here's another quote from the John Walton N.T. Wright book. It says, Genesis 2 explains how humans function in sacred space and on its behalf, in contrast to Genesis 1, which addressed how sacred space functioned for humanity. I don't know whether John Walton wrote that part or N.T. Wright. It was probably N.T. Wright. He's always going on about the interaction between man and creation, the image of God. You know, Ned. Yeah, I don't know if that's what the N in N.T. Wright stands for. What does the N in N.T. Wright stand for? Let's see. Nicholas. I can see it.
Oh my God!
3. Myth shows theological superiority. One common accusation against the Bible is that it simply retold old myths. But although myths from ancient Near East share motifs like the divine creating order out of chaos, massive flooding, temple symbolism within creation, there are also massive differences. The overlap could be explained by shared history or even a shared biology. Flood narratives appear in Native American and Chinese myth, even though they had no communication with the ancient Near East. There's something psychologically significant about flooding that captivates cultures. Some of the earliest Christians saw the overlap of the Bible and other ancient myths and didn't deny it. Justin Martyr said, "Whatever things are rightly said among all men are the property of us Christians. For we worship and love the Logos, And so here's a key to understanding why overlap with ancient myths doesn't imply that the Bible is false. John 1:1 says that Christ is the Logos, the pattern that structures all of reality. St. Paul says that God is discernible in creation, not just nature, but creation. So that includes the human psyche. And so all enduring religions and myths are the better efforts to grope for the pattern of Christ without his incarnation as a human. Clement of Alexandria, another very early Orthodox Christian, said, "Myths are not mere fables, but contain certain truths, concealed under dark sayings and legends." And this is what brain scientists like Ian McGilchrist and John Vervaeke are trying to tell us about myth. These are real insights about things that matter. And some of the most influential Christians of recent times view myth along these lines. C.S. Lewis says in The Problem of Pain, "I could never believe that the cultures that invented the myth of Balder or Osiris were wholly wrong about the universe. There's too much truth in their stories." Lewis admired pagan myths for their moral insight, tragic vision, and yearning for redemption. But this doesn't mean that Christian texts are a redundant copy of other myths. They are the culmination, the magnum opus of human myth. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, "God used material in pagan religions, though they were full of error, to prepare the way for Christianity. The myths were God expressing himself through the minds of poets, using images he knew they would understand." So the Bible stories, sharing motifs, doesn't mean they're plagiarism. Oral tradition or just common intellectual milieu could be at play here without the writer of Genesis getting their hands on a copy of pagan myth and stealing it for their own fame. Genesis makes, or whatever the case of how the overlaps happen, Genesis makes significant theological corrections to these myths. The mytho-history in Genesis describes a righteous monotheistic God rather than a capricious pantheon, bringing the flood because humans were too loud. Although, if you've ever lived in apartments, you could kind of understand Enlil's plight. According to Mesopotamian myth, humans were created for forced labor after the gods got tired of working. The gods were not obligated to discuss any of their moral logic. The gods do not tell the truth unless it benefits them. Divine sex is manipulative and violent, and their gods are short-sighted and have no one to offer them sacrifices after they flood the area. According to Canaanite myth, gods are unstable and killable. Baal died every year, which causes drought. Divine feasts are chaotic, embarrassing. El got drunk, vomited, collapsed, and soiled himself. Gods are neither righteous nor loyal, with no moral code grounding their behavior. According to Egyptian myth, humans can force gods into submission, which eliminates any transcendent accountability for human leaders, and cosmic order constantly collapses. So imagine the pragmatic benefit of switching from these amoral and unreliable gods to a righteous and constant monotheistic God. Now, instead of viewing justice as arbitrary and fate being unstable, you can take radical responsibility for any chaotic situation and feel resilient enough to get to the perennial causes of suffering as an individual and as communities, seeking stability rather than throwing up your hands. Gary John Bishop, a best-selling author and high-level life coach from Glasgow, Scotland, some of my favorite writers from there, Glasgow. It's kind of like all the best athletes come from Compton. Maybe all the best rappers too. Anyways, Gary says things like, "You're not your circumstances. You're what you're willing to do about them. And stop waiting for someone else to fix your life. And take responsibility for the way your life is now." So you can see why Justin Martyr respected the logical Greek philosophers before him who tried to get to a stable underlying reality to things, same as Gary John Bishop, who often quotes Greek philosophers in his books. Justin Martyr even called Socrates a Christian. Paul quotes two pagan philosophers, positively Areopagus, but that's a philosophy rabbit hole. We're in a myth rabbit hole right now, and I'm getting kind of tired of it. That's probably enough screen time for you. After you like this video and subscribe to my channel, get outside and dance to some white girl music.